Now I'd like to introduce our next topic titled mino-bimaadiziwin, also known as living a good life. We've brought together Indigenous perspectives on the environment, community, and on reconciling development and our collective responsibility to future generations. Our chair is the esteemed Phil Fontaine, the executive advisor of Ishkonigan, Canada's foremost Indigenous consulting firm, and a well-known leader at the forefront of important Indigenous issues and projects for decades. Described as bold, tenacious, and solution-oriented, as well as forward-looking, Phil is a former three-term National Chief of the Assembly of First Nations. Highly respected in Canada and abroad, Phil Fontaine attended President Obama's inauguration, met with Pope Benedict XVI, to gain an apology for his people and raise the corporate challenge to Canadian organizations. We are thrilled to have him as our next session chair, alongside distinguished guests who will share their time and perspectives. Once again, there will be some time for questions at the end of the session. Please use the Engage tab to submit them. Phil, the floor is yours.
Thank you for a wonderfully generous introduction. I'm really honored to be a part of this panel discussion. We have an outstanding group of panelists that represent particular points of view with respect to the topic at hand. Each of the panelists bring wide knowledge and experience in different fields. And I am absolutely certain that they'll bring some important perspectives to the topic at hand. We all recognize that there's a real drive to go green. And going green means challenges to the economy in ways that we haven't witnessed or experienced in some time. And one of the sectors that is very involved and deeply impacted, of course, is nuclear energy, and in particular, the topic at hand here, nuclear waste, energy, and the storage of waste. And First Nations, indeed Indigenous peoples, have a particular interest in this matter. It's been before our community for many, many years, and we are now at a point of making a decision as to how we take healthy advantage of the opportunities this particular sector offers our Indigenous communities. And so the panelists we have here will help us gain a deeper appreciation of what the sector represents in terms of opportunities for our communities, the sensitivities around the issue, nuclear waste, and how it's going to be managed in the future in terms of storage. And so we are in a position to, as I said, to through this panel have a very full discussion on this matter. And what I'd like to do at this point, before we begin the discussion, is call on each of the panel members to introduce themselves, starting with Jolaine, please.
Here, and to be discussing an important topic such as this. I'm Gitsan Wet'suwet'en from the northwest of British Columbia. I grew up in Hazelton, which is probably about 2 hours inland from Prince Rupert. And I started at Deloitte probably in the 90s, somewhere in there, and did a bunch of different things up until now. I came back to Deloitte about 3 years ago, and to basically build a practice in the prairies here within Indigenous communities. I'm now a partner and the Prairies Indigenous Client Services leader. And basically I came back to work directly with First Nations on their priorities in working towards self-governance and independence. A big part of my background is governance, administration, financial management, wealth, growth, and sustainability. So I'm working right now directly with First Nations across Alberta to start, especially on administration and making them more efficient, and then going into the businesses, restructuring, implementation, strategic planning, all of what is included with that. But yeah, it's great to be here and to be part of this panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Jolaine. May I call on my good friend Gary to be next in introduction?
Yeah, good morning, everybody, or afternoon, I guess, over in Ontario. Very honored to be here. So just wanted to thank everybody for the opportunity getting together like this. Nice to see Phil and my other panel members this afternoon or this morning, depending on where we're at. Just a little bit of an introduction on myself. Currently, I'm the Executive Vice President, Chief Development Officer for the Northwest Company. I'm based out of Winnipeg. Prior to this, I was CEO of a group of First Nation-owned companies in Saskatchewan where we did retail, construction, steel fabrication. Prior to that, I was Vice President at Cameco Corporation, one of the world's largest uranium mining companies in the world. And before that, I was a member of Parliament for Northern Saskatchewan and Grand Chief, so I'm a recovering politician as well. I think I'm on step 6 of the cycle, or of the recovery portion. I'm also a member of the Peter Ballantyne Cree Nation, first and foremost, born and raised on the reserve in Northern Saskatchewan. Really immersed in our culture, our language, fishing, hunting, and trapping, and I lived a lot with my grandpa, who raised me for quite a few years, and primarily my aunts as well. And I always share a funny story with my grandpa, who said, "No sim, you better go to school, get a degree, go to university, because if you have to feed your family based on hunting and trapping, you'll probably go hungry. So go to school and do well." So with that, nice to meet everyone.
And one bit of information for sports enthusiasts. Gary also at one time played junior hockey with the Flint Lawn Bombers.
80 pounds ago.
Yeah. Thank you for your introduction there, Gary. Now how do you pronounce your name? Kaella?
That's correct.
Okay. Sorry about that.
No worries. Bojo Kanawea, hello everyone. Ajanikwa Nawachagijik, Dejnikaz. My name is Angel, a woman light coming over the clouds. My English name is Kaella Earle. Weequem Kong Minwa Airland, Donjaba, Chatham, Kent, Ndida. I'm from Wacomiquong and Airland First Nations in Ontario, but I live in Chatham, Kent, and grew up in Sudbury, which is the Robinson-Huron Treaty of 1850 territory. Makwan Dodam, Anishinaabe Kwentao. I'm Bear Clan and an Anishinaabe woman, Chinandem Nonko. I'm happy to be here today. I currently work as an engineer in training at Enbridge Gas. I lead large storage and transmission expansion for natural gas projects. I also work as vice chair to the Indigenous Advisory Committee of the Canada Energy Regulator, helping advise the board on implementing reconciliation, developing a pathway for the implementation of the UN Declaration, and strategies for the inclusion of Indigenous peoples in federally regulated energy projects in an actionable and systemic approach. I'm additionally involved in a variety of activities at the regional and national level in health and wellness of Indigenous communities, policy development, data innovation, energy transition, science education, and cultural revitalization. I often like to discuss Indigenous worldviews as a conduit for energy innovation, something that I've been focused a lot on recently. particularly in the space of energy transition and targeting engineers and other energy professionals. Understanding Indigenous knowledge will help energy professionals and energy innovators really put the land and the people at the forefront of the way that they approach how they design methods for energy moving into the future, which is so critically important right now in the face of climate change. So those have been my main focuses. Miigwech.
Miigwech, Kaella. Thank you so much. Now I'll turn it over to Matt.
Hi, I'm Matt Long. I'm Métis, originally from Winnipeg. I currently work for the Métis Nation of Ontario in Kenora. I work with communities, to support their involvement in around nuclear waste management and decommissioning. You know what? I'll just leave it at that.
To call on Mr. Lonechild. Guy? Lonechild. Where's Mr. Lonechild? Guy? Hello?
I think he had to drop off. Yeah.
Oh, you did, eh?
Connection issues.
Oh, okay. How about Charlie Watt, Senator Watt? Is he on? From Makivik or Makivik, whatever the pronunciation is. Senator Watt. Well, I guess he's not. I guess he's dropped off as well. So anyway, so we have 4 panelists, an outstanding group of individuals, accomplished, each representing particular perspectives on the subject matter at hand. They can go beyond the discussion around nuclear waste, if you wish, panel members. But, our expectation is that we will be able to educate and inform the many participants in this summit. I understand that there's a significant number of participants that are viewing this presentation. For the ease of the conversation that we hope to have, we forwarded about 5 questions or perspectives, if you will, to generate discussion regarding this matter. And each of the panel members can take either of the 5 and build on the perspective that's represented in each of these either points of view or questions. For example, how would an Indigenous specific consultation on process seek to satisfy the duty to consult? This also leads us to a conversation or discussion on engagement versus consent for your communities. This is particularly interesting because we're dealing with a very sensitive issue, and a fair conclusion to what we do with this will require a lot of discussion and consultation. So I ask any one of you of the 4 to weigh in on this matter. Who would like to start? And I call on the gentleman from Kenora, Matt Long, to.
Okay, so I work in this area a lot with a few different Métis communities, and the issue of kind of engagement versus consent is one that we deal with a lot. We really don't find that consent is involved. It is largely engagement, and in the past, it's been largely, I guess, a box ticking exercise. And this is something that I can't go on. It's something that I'd like to see very much change for engagement with communities. Well, going beyond engagement and actually having consent and building consent with communities. Generally, it's just proponents and industry telling communities about projects and communities giving feedback, and then projects often just going ahead. This is something that I definitely like to see to change, and I am seeing with a lot of projects starting to change, and the NWMO is definitely approaching this in a way that focuses more on building consent that I'm quite happy with so far. Yeah, and this is something that's kind of needed to build trust too. And if it's just an exercise in fulfilling like a legal duty and that there's no real meaningful change or thought given to input from communities, it's not really a proper, true relationship. And that's something that's greatly needed. I guess I'll give some other people some time. I don't want to take up too much. I know that we have some very knowledgeable panelists here that can add to that.
Thank you, Matt. Jolaine? Or Jolaine?
Yeah, I definitely agree with Matt. I think in my experience working with Golder Associates, I worked a lot with oil and gas companies, and especially in pipelines, in developing participation plans to include First Nations in the development and maintenance of the pipelines. So I think the best advice I could give on that is consult with the intention to obtain consent. It's very clearly stated in Bill C-15 that Canada must take all measures necessary to ensure that the laws of Canada are consistent with the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and must prepare and implement an action plan to achieve the objectives of the declaration. In order to obtain consent, you need to obtain consent not just from elected leadership, but it's also important where there is also hereditary leaders, like in my area. We have within the Gitxsan Nation over 52 hereditary chiefs that are recognized not just by the nation itself, but by the government in making decisions over the land. So you will definitely need not just engagement, but to really try to obtain consent, especially over developing a national strategy for radioactive waste. So, I mean, I'll let someone else speak that.
Thank you. Thank you. Gary, you represent a company with a very broad presence in the north, all the way into Alaska, and then in the south. And given your experience with Comenco and your duties as a member of parliament and just your extensive knowledge and experience working with our people, how do you view this matter?
Well, I think at the opening of the session, they talked about mino-bimaadiziwin and leading to a good life, and it's so dependent on a number of factors in answering that question that you posed. I think number one, and these are all interrelated, and bear with me for a second, but the honor of the crown in this whole process, reconciliation, understanding the impact of systemic racism and unconscious bias, and then of course, understanding what fair and equitable consultation and engagement looks like. And let me come around to those a bit here very briefly. So with respect to the honor of crown, not much to say there other than the fiduciary responsibility, Section 35, recognition and affirmation of rights for First Nations, Métis and Inuit, and that really government is supposed to act in the best interest of. Okay, so Does that happen? Isn't that much as it should? That's always up for debate. Second issue, though, around reconciliation is, unfortunately, the reality of Indigenous people's experience in Canada is one where we had some engineered socioeconomic disparity structured against us. And so, businesses were prevented, Indigenous businesses were prevented from prospering and thriving, even though they were. It was illegal to hire lawyers, all that stuff, hence the need. And the TRC Commission, which, Phil, I thank you personally for your role in all of this and many others. But the TRC's commission and the calls to action are so critically important to understand, not just number 92, but the full scope, and looking at that, the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls report and the recommendations. So reconciliation is so important. So taking the honor of the Crown, taking reconciliation, and one of the big operative questions coming out of this is, what is required to maintain the honor of the Crown, but also effect reconciliation. So let me go to my next one, which is unfortunately one that's, we've seen in the underbelly exposed in North America and globally for that matter, which is understanding systemic racism and unconscious bias. And I ask you to bear with me because I'll come back to the question. With the recent events with Barbara Kentner and Thunder Bay or Joyce Echaquan in Montreal, George Floyd, Colton Bushy, all these things, it really has exposed. And I'm going to zero in on an issue. And I come at this from the perspectives you talked about, Phil, and I was the co-chair of the National Energy Board's Modernization Act a few years ago. Of course, working in a corporation, a mining company, to working as in government, federal and provincial, as a Grand Chief from a First Nation. So I'm kind of consolidating the views here, but one of the things that I see corporations, governments, project proponents, regulators approach Indigenous communities on is they pathologize. There's this pathologizing cycle. Most Canadians, they just skim our community. They maybe drove by, they landed for a few minutes, and they see certain things. Maybe they see some poverty examples of it. They see kids out of school. They see various things. Things enter their mind. They go to their office and they justify what they think they saw by reading reports, highest rates of this, lowest rates of that. And they begin to confuse the culture of our people with the culture of poverty, and they misread the situation, right? So then after they've skimmed the community, they go to their office and justify, they know they have to work with that community and engage with them, but then they begin to predict what that engagement could look like. Well, maybe based on what I saw, what I read, they can be a laborer. They couldn't be an engineer. They couldn't be a nurse. They couldn't be this and that. Maybe it's these entry-level type of jobs. Then they move to prescribing it, and they deficit theorize our community and our people. And then they prescribe that, okay, here's what our engagement will look like. And this is just a constant pathologizing that unfortunately happens all too often. And the impact on traditional knowledge is it is minimized, if not disregarded in that process. The Indigenous knowledge that I think Kaella in her opening comments talked about gets minimized because of this pathologization, deficit theorizing of our communities. So then the impact on meaningful consultation and engagement, when you consider perhaps the honor of the Crown is not where it should be, reconciliation, we got a lot of work to do, systemic racism and unconscious bias. Now you think of it from an Indigenous perspective, of First Nations, Métis or Inuit community perspective. When you're dealing with a project proponent, you've got to deal with them on whatever the project is. So you got to deal with them. You got to meet with them. You may be negotiating an impact agreement. You're trying to understand the scope of the project, and then you're engaging with the province and regulators, federal regulators. You're engaging with ISC. You're probably engaging with, and you have to engage with your own community members to explain to them what the project's all about and the impact. You're probably going through environmental assessment, regulatory review processes. you've got this jurisdictional silos of First Nation Métis Inuit communities forced to deal with, and each of those federal or regulator or provincial type of roles and players are operating their own silos with a narrow view, not understanding what the First Nation in this case may have to deal with. So getting to that free, prior, and informed consent is quite the journey. And maybe I can elaborate on that a bit because I've taken up too much time, but it is all interrelated and very critical as it rolls out in actual practical engagement and consultation in the communities.
Very good. Kaella.
Miigwech, so I have a couple things that I want to say about this, and I'll just start off by explaining kind of where I'm coming from in a cultural perspective. And I actually refer back to this word so much. Like every time I think about this word, it has really helped me, and it provides a different sort of context when we're thinking about really complex problems. But this teaching came from one of my friends, Elton Beardy from Northern Ontario. So respect, as one of the 7 sacred teachings for Anishinaabeg in Ontario, all over Ontario, the word itself in Anishinaabemowin is mino-bimaadiziwin. And I'm sure more than a couple folks on this panel are aware of the word. The first part of the word mino-bimaadiziwin refers to cherishing, to give things their time or mutual benefit. The second part, ide, is the concept of reciprocity, and win is a way of living. So the entire word for respect, mino-bimaadiziwin, it's a way of living where you're cherishing or giving things their time in a reciprocal way. And so it's a little different from the Western understanding of respect, where you can't earn respect. Like Anishinaabe, you can't earn respect. It just doesn't exist unless it's mutual. So kind of building on that concept, and in my view, consent would be respect, and respect is two-way. So two-way consensus on a solution that, as Gary has mentioned, works to address socioeconomic disparity in a meaningful way. So Indigenous professionals, Indigenous engineers, Indigenous project leadership, all of these things require people to be able to meaningfully communicate and in the spirit of friendship. And the energy industry really has a responsibility to help facilitate Indigenous success, which is vast. You know, a lot of people get, that conversation gets lost oftentimes. We're so focused on trauma, and yes, the trauma is there, but there's also so much success and so much entrepreneurship. And how are you championing that? And this is what I hope to see inside of the consultation process, and really that meaningful communication and spirit of friendship, it applies for everyone involved. So there's a bad history, but we need to stay open to building a new relationship while allowing past failures to guide us to succeed in working together. I also want to chat about the fear around what consent means and whether or not it's a veto. And actually, I want to tell you a story that was told to me a few months ago by the former Honorable Senator Marie Sinclair about this. It's a pretty funny story, and I'll never forget it. He told me he was in a class full of judges, and someone asked him what the difference between consent and veto was. And he said, if you asked me to have sex with you and I said no, that's consent. But if you want to go have sex with some other man, I couldn't do anything about it because that would be a veto. So you're free to go have sex with someone else. And that was how he described the difference between veto and consent. And I just thought that spicy description was such an excellent way to really, hit home that understanding. Additionally, and on top of all of this, we must make space for ceremony. And this is something that I talked about with the Senator as well. So ceremony, really across the board is the foundation of important decision-making for Indigenous communities. So opening organizations to tearing down old policy that oppresses the place of ceremony inside of negotiations, an important business, really needs to stop. There are so many ways to normalize ceremony inside of where you work and make those culturally relevant and culturally safe practices for Indigenous people in your organizations normal. There's all kinds of things I'm seeing now in the movement of mental health, and things like, crisis lines and other resources for mental health, get an in-house elder. That'll help you figure out how to talk to Indigenous people way better. I think that those sorts of things are really important, and normalizing them is going to make the entire process a lot easier and more peaceful, and people will be more open to approaching negotiations and approaching conversations in the spirit of friendship.
A good start to this discussion. I want to take a step back. Now, we've talked about consent and engagement. This leads me to perspective on the shared history, our shared history in Canada. And that has brought us to some real pressure points regarding ecological interests and economic pressures. Excuse me. How does traditional Indigenous knowledge help in achieving the kind of balance that we are seeking? So I'll start with Jolaine on this topic.
Phil, I think it's important to acknowledge that there is no one-size-fits-all answer to this question. In order to understand the answer to that question, I think it's important to understand what kind of industry you're talking about, where is the development taking place, which Indigenous people are you referring to, and what rights do they have that will be impacted. Having said that, it's clear that Indigenous peoples have been able to live in harmony with the environment since the beginning of time. And in order to tackle major problems like waste, climate change, and pollution, Indigenous people have a lot of traditional and environmental knowledge to offer to find a balance if people are willing to listen. And I think that's super key. We, especially, I can only speak for myself within the Gitxsan territory, not just the men, but the women are excellent trappers. They know the land. They know their hereditary territory. They know exactly where the lines lie on that territory. So they know the plants for healing. I can't even tell you, many of our elders and medicine people are extremely knowledgeable when it comes to understanding the land and how to preserve it. But at the same time, they aren't against development and prosperity. So I think your first priority should be to listen. And that's all I'll say about that.
Okay. Thank you, Jolaine. Can I turn to you on this one, Gary, now?
Sure. I think it's a very good question, and I think first and foremost, regulators, project proponents, and all those involved have to be intentional in making room for it. If you don't make room for it, you end up not having any type of authentic or meaningful conversation about it, and you certainly don't learn about it. I share a bit of a story at my time working with a mining company where our exploration group were encroaching on people's trap lines. And the trapper was upset and said, listen, you're impacting me. And one of our colleagues in the exploration said, I don't know what his problem is. He says, when we go in there, I see animal tracks everywhere. That we haven't scared them off or anything, they're everywhere. And so we went back and forth, had a conversation between him and I said, listen, where do you live? And he says, I live on the outskirts of Saskatoon. So you drive in, you drive through a few farms or by a few farms. So you notice that, with cattle, the cows coming out of a barn, they follow a path out to the pasture. And that says, animals are largely creatures of habit to a very large extent. And wild animals, and most animals, right? So they follow a path. Then they get out to the pasture and they do go around and feed. I said, such is the same for marten or a fox or a lynx. I said, so when we're going in as an exploration company, we're altering the patterns that the trapper has read over years of experience and how we're impacting the patterns of those animals. So we are impacting his trap line. He just doesn't willy-nilly throw a trap down and hope and go like this that he gets a fur-bearing animal, right? It's intentional. It's based on knowledge, traditional knowledge. And then we had other examples where, you know, there's woodland caribou. There was a big discussion that species at risk, and the communities were very well attuned to the migration patterns of the woodland caribou. And in Saskatchewan, they're saying they were near extinction or they're at great risk, and it may or may not have been, but Indigenous knowledge was not factored in. And what was interesting, when you looked at a map of Canada, the woodland caribou was a bit at risk between Alberta and Saskatchewan, but they changed right at the border. It's funny how the woodland caribou understood where the border was, and they changed their status from being at risk to not at risk, right? And so the communities were saying, you know, here's what's really happening out there. And they were engaging with regulators in Saskatchewan about, you know, on the ground, what's happening. So making room for it. But I think one of the most critical things is being intentional and making room for it, provide the resources, invite them in-house. And just one little final example, we're dealing with a treated water release in northern Saskatchewan. And the regulator, CNSC, had said, it's approved, you can release it. And the company went to the communities, and the community said, no, don't release it. It says, we want you to provide us some of resources so we can do our own study so we're comfortable. And at first, the mining company as well, no, the regulator said, it's okay. And we said, no, provide resources to said communities, let them do their own testing. And it did another year of testing. And the communities came back and said, you know what, it is accurate. We feel comfortable. And then they went on to describe the food cycle, you know, with the insects at the bottom of the lake to the fish and to the ducks, and very fulsome discussion. And our regulators and our people in the company were just so focused and took that knowledge in. And then they allowed that water to be released. That built trust. But there was reciprocity in knowledge and sharing, but you have to be very intentional and you have to provide resources for that to happen.
Well said, Gary. Kaella?
There's a couple of things I can think of in particular, and I guess I'll mostly share some success that I've seen. The first I want to mention is Indigenous Advisory and Monitoring Committees. The CER calls them IAMCs, and basically these are specialized boots on the ground committees with technical training that monitor regulatory processes and also provide advice and recommendations that are project specific. And these are folks, you know, from local communities with meaningful work like pipeline inspectors that also carry cultural knowledge. And this would be an amazing thing to normalize right across the board, in my opinion, for every energy, every discipline in energy. And I can see this benefiting everyone, including project leads, engineers, other technical personnel, and really helping them develop a sense of how they approach problem solving. The second I want to mention is Indigenous Advisory Committees. So the formation of these committees can advise governing systems and help your organization keep up with the changing landscape of energy regulation, specific to the inclusion of Indigenous people and perspectives. I expect there to be a great amount of change occurring, and it will be beneficial for any energy company to get ahead of this, while also improving the cultural competence of the organization and its leaders and help guide decisions in the light of Indigenous knowledge, procure Indigenous businesses, change hiring and retention strategies for Indigenous people, and more. This benefits the entire organization. So really when you look at energy, innovation is so important moving forward. And the foundation of innovation is understanding and implementing different perspectives, something that Indigenous people can provide in this capacity. So the third I want to mention are having strong Indigenous relations teams. So take a look at your organization. Is Indigenous engagement matched together with public or municipal affairs or your environmental group? Yes, they can work together with those groups, but they need their own resources and their own executive leadership. So putting an Indigenous person on your executive team to lead that is so important, which would ultimately advise your organization's leadership and allow for a pathway for Indigenous knowledge at that level so that it can be impacting the entire organization. So those, like, I guess that's more on the side of like how to develop a pathway for Indigenous traditional knowledge to help achieve that balance between energy and Indigenous peoples. Miigwech.
Matt Long, Kenora.
I definitely agree with all the previous panelists, and the biggest hurdle I've seen is the issues of capacity and being provided resources to meaningfully provide in the discussion and give traditional knowledge that exists. A lot of communities have very limited capacity to participate. There's a lot of other issues in all these communities that leadership has to deal with. There's lack of staff hours often to be able to organize any studies or organize any, any monitoring done by the community itself. It's always an issue in building capacity within the community to be able to meaningfully participate and be able to provide its knowledge is a huge barrier sometimes. There are, in most all Indigenous communities, there are much potentially more pressing issues, social issues. We can see this right now with the pandemic. It's there's issues there that are going to be prioritized over a lot of this engagement and knowledge sharing. And this is something that government and industry has to be aware of, that there are other priorities, there are shortages of resources, there are barriers that communities may need help to overcome or may not be able to overcome because the other priority is so great. This is just an issue that I've seen that I really want to be able to bring up and share, and to some degree I'm wondering what the other panelists think about this.
Do you want to ask anyone in particular, Matt?
No, I'll open it up to everyone.
Well, if there's someone that wants to weigh in on this, you're free to do so. Matt has asked a question, and he's looking for a perspective from either the three other panelists, or where we can move on to the next topic and come back to Matt's question at some point in the discussion. You'll be okay with that, Matt? If there's not a... Okay, very well. So each of us involved in this discussion have been impacted in one way or another by the extractive industry, whether it's a mine or, everyone has, particularly those people from the north. And I look at the panelists here, we're all from the north, including Matt, who now resides in Kenora. So for the longest time, and this point has been made, right, that policy has not reflected the interests of Indigenous peoples when it comes to the extractive industry. And our discussion today is centered on nuclear energy, this very important sector particularly around the issue of green energy, the green economy, and in particular, as far as we're concerned, the place of Indigenous peoples in this sector. And so the big challenge for us as Indigenous peoples is how do we influence policy related to this very important sector in the Canadian economy in a way that exceeds anything that has been in place up to now. And given the fact that, we're being asked to consider waste and how that's going to be managed in the future. Is it going to be on Indigenous lands? What is going to happen? And how do we influence the decisions that will be taken by industry, by governments at every level, but more importantly, Indigenous governments and our communities? So who wants to start on this? Gary, can I call on you, please?
Sure. So a few things there. It's critically important. Indigenous issues with respect to public policy, maybe start there for a bit. Indigenous issues are highly political in this country, fortunately or unfortunately. It is the way it is. But yet, when you poll Canadians, Indigenous issues usually don't crack the top echelons of importance. Because they're so highly politicized, I've seen, and like I said, I'm a recovering politician, you've seen political parties say, my Indigenous policy is better than yours. And the change in governments, you'll see 2 steps forward, sometimes 3 or 4 steps back, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, because it's constantly churning. They read Canadians' perceptions and the importance of, they think their policy is better. And, in recent years, from an Indigenous perspective, I've reached out to all political parties fairly and say, there should be, this Indigenous issue should be as nonpartisan as possible. We need to find space within our parliamentary systems that allow for meaningful best practices, Indigenous people involved at the highest levels in creating policy space and good policy for Indigenous issues, because leaving it entirely to the whims of politicians sometimes ain't the best way to go. So I think that's one issue, is it's highly political and that can hinder. Second is there's a unique public policy challenge for Indigenous communities as well. There's demographic conflict. The majority of our population is under the age of 22 or so. The Canadian population over the age of 45. So if you're a public policy maker, you tend to skew to the majority. We're also geographically marginalized. We are largely in the north. There's a small population over very large geographic areas. But it also even applies to an urban area where we're in an inner city. You can be as lonely and isolated sometimes in an inner city when you're surrounded by a large population. So we have this geographic marginalization. I've met with public policy people, elected, non-elected, and say, well, how do we justify an expense for these two, just the demographic and geographic marginalization? It creates a decision between knee and hip replacement versus early childhood health, Indigenous health. Like, it's a real issue. They'll say, how do I justify spending millions on infrastructure in the north? And so these are legit questions. But sometimes they stop right there. They don't go any deeper. They don't try to find solutions. Then you're confronted with the third piece, which is the jurisdictional chaos. To what extent are the feds, to the province, to even NGOs, to corporations, to what extent are these parties involved in actually creating good public policy? So from an Indigenous perspective, trying to advance good public policy can be a struggle because of that unique public policy challenge. So examples of that are, the carbon tax, which I'm in favor of, but how do you drive increased costs to carbon stranded communities in the north? the impact of carbon tax on northern communities when they have no other source of power other than diesel. You raise the fuel costs on ships that take food and it impacts food security. You change drug reform and you lower the fees, but then local northern pharmacies and drug distribution is impacted for elders in particular, where you got to spend more time on language and packaging the drugs differently and talking a bit more. To pilot flying times, you raise the cost of pilots, or you reduce the number of hours pilots fly, so then there's less flights to the north. They're more costly and all this. These are just seem innocuous public policy decisions that are small p or small, but they have huge impacts on northern and Indigenous populations. So I just give those as a few examples. So tying it to the extractive industry, there is a huge opportunity here because a lot of Canada's wealth comes from the extractive industry, which comes from the north. And the distribution of that wealth predominantly stays in the north. So involving Indigenous people and exploring ways to get them more involved in the economic outcomes, from procurement to employment to value add processing to working more within that to create wealth generation and help keep some of that wealth regional and to the north, and so we can invest in our own communities, becomes extremely critical. So and Indigenous people need to be on the consultation side, need to be involved in the full mining cycle, right from the earliest of the planning before it's a desktop exercise right to operations. So I'll stop there at this point. So.
Thank you, Gary. Good intervention. That reminds me of the situation in Northern Ontario with Big Trout Lake, and this junior exploration company tried to move in without due regard to the interests of the First Nation community. And they were relying on this outdated mining act that was really a free entry system to the north. It hadn't been amended in, as I said, in 135 years before these before the leadership of that community intervened and finally forced the government to change policy. We shouldn't have to go to those lengths to convince government that there are certain policies that need to be amended in a way that reflects the interests of our communities. And Gary, thanks for your intervention. Jolaine?
I would have to say that more and more, as I am working directly with communities, that more communities are becoming a lot more strategic, which is a really, really positive thing when it comes to governance and policy development. I find that the most successful communities have their own constitutions. They have land use policies. They have an idea of where they're going. So from that perspective, I think that it's really important if we want to have influence on policies, and we need to start leading in a really huge way when it comes to our land and our rights to that land. But in saying that, policies are really great, but they can change at any time. The most important thing is practices that are guided by policies, which are put in place by lawmakers, legislations, and regulations. Until law and regulations are changed to reflect the need to obtain consent from Indigenous peoples prior to the issuance of a permit or a license, then really I don't see a lot changing. Laws and regulations need to change in order for the policies and practices to change. And in that way, I really think our leadership has to be more involved on that side of things, in influencing change in laws and so forth. Thanks, Phil.
Thank you, Kaella. Jolaine, Kaella, please.
Miigwech, Phil. I I think one of the main things is recognizing the braiding of three different types of law that seems to be the movement that is occurring right now. So, you know, the three types of law are national Canadian law, international law, and Indigenous laws, all of which are vastly different and understood in completely different ways. So recognizing all three together as a country and as Turtle Island is no easy feat, not even including the fact that each community is sovereign. So for Anishinaabeg communities, these are sets of Inokanagewan community laws that must be taken into account. Building on what Gary has mentioned, the policy space around Indigenous issues must be nonpartisan, and really people must open their minds to the fact that there's an entirely other world of law involved. So how are policymakers, politicians, the Crown, and others opening themselves to understanding something like a chain or a wampum as a set of laws? This brings us back to the concept of making space for ceremony and making a serious effort to understanding that ceremony and the cultural relevance of everything that Indigenous communities do. So cultural and language revitalization is what will strengthen those processes, ultimately bringing us to rebuilding those relationships and helping us move forward together on mutually beneficial solutions. I also want to echo what Gary has said about early engagement and what Jolaine has said about capacity building of communities around policy development. For me, the development of the Inokanagewan and related processes. For an engineer like me, this means considering Indigenous perspectives, engagement, and law in the design phase of your project, not the execution or post-execution phase, which is too often the case. So, miigwech.
Thank you, Kaella. I noticed that you're not like most engineers that have this linear perspective on life, right? Your perspective is really broadly based, non-traditional engineer, if I might say. Well put, Matt.
Okay. Where to begin? So engagement early in the design on a project is something that's really needed for a community to be able to understand and have relevant input. And not in just a project, but also in new policy and regulation that will affect the community, and creating and designing of processes for assessing a project or new policy are really needed. You have to have the community involved throughout the entire process for all of these, for it to be built in a way that works for them and with their culture. It's all the communities are quite different, and trying to work this out can be difficult too. I'm having a hard time being succinct in all my thoughts here, but this is kind of important. Communities need to be involved throughout these processes. When you design a process or how something's looked at or something that's going to affect the community, you need to involve them. You need to be able to get feedback early on to design these in a way that is respectful to the communities. And well, we have one question here in the chat. How should a proponent seek consent if it's unclear if First Nations or Métis communities agree to who has rights in a territory, or if one disputes another's claim? And the reality is you've got to work with them all, and you have to find ways that work and build consent with all of them. If they feel and that they have rights in an area, you have to work with them. You have to work to seek, not just seek consent, but build consent and build understanding and build them into the design and development of the project. You've got to consider a lot. You've got to consider economic inclusion is a huge issue that I guess gets overlooked often, and how these communities are going to be included from early on. It's often a afterthought, and we'll try and get, you know, certain jobs to these people, or try and get priority to these groups for these jobs, when you should be building and educating and creating careers and futures for people, not just, again, as I've said before, there's often, it seems like it's just trying to check a box when it should be building long-term relationships. I'll hand it over to the rest of the panel to continue the discussion and answer any more of these questions that have come up.
Thank you very much, Matt. So we're getting close to the end of our time here. I would like to call on each of you to give closing remarks, but before I turn to Kaella to start the last part of our conversation here, we've touched on consent versus veto. We've talked about balance between ecological interests and industry. We've talked about policy development and how that impacts Indigenous interests. We've talked about extractive industry, but not particularly about nuclear energy and nuclear waste management and the like. I think we've touched on that in a more indirect way. So I'd like to call on each of you to give your perspective on our future in terms of development and the economy. I would make the point that the law is on our side, right? You made the point, Kaella, about traditional traditions, legal traditions, Indigenous legal traditions, and that is of critical importance when we talk about our place in the economy, in my view. So if you could give us your some closing perspectives on the discussion we had here this morning.
Thank you much, Phil. I just really want to challenge everyone in the crowd to learn about Indigenous peoples and reach out, learn about our laws, include yourselves in our ceremonies, get involved with community events. How are you reaching out to the community and really trying to build up that friendship? When seeking consent, you need to build that friendship, and doing all of those things like being involved in the community, understanding the laws, understanding the language, and even some things as simple as understanding the language and being able to greet Indigenous people from that community, knowing their proper, community name, knowing their proper language, makes a humongous difference and shows that you're committed to building a friendship with them. And I think that's so important. And you really need to make space for ceremony and culturally relevant practices. Another thing, kind of on the topic of seeking consent, is don't be afraid of the conversation. And honestly, I'd say proponents need to stop waiting for an answer from the Crown and actually just make an effort to build a relationship and understand the needs and priorities of each community. That's going to make everything so much better. I can't tell you how many times I've seen situations where people are so scared of having the conversation with the community that they will wait years. And that really, that causes problems like consultation fatigue for the communities, drains them of their very small amount of resources, drains proponents of resources for no reason. We have to stop being afraid of talking to each other. And it's, maybe the first couple of conversations won't be great, but it's going to improve if you make the effort. And that's really what is required, making the effort to build a relationship, making space for ceremony, and approaching all of your negotiations and business dealings with Indigenous communities in the spirit of friendship. And I think that that's so important for both Indigenous communities to understand and energy proponents in the development of the future of energy solutions. And also, please reach out to me on LinkedIn if you want to chat with me. Always happy to make new friends and talk to people. Miigwech.
Thank you very much, Kaella. You've been very, very helpful in helping us understand the various challenges that are before Indigenous communities when it comes to industry and the economy and our place in all of that. Jolaine.
Thank you, Phil. Yeah, I would have to say that it's important to remember that each community is extremely different. You know, and a lot of people ask me, so from an Indigenous perspective, it's, and I always have a challenge with that because, you know, I don't see myself as Indigenous. I am Gitxsan and Wet'suwet'en. My dad is Wet'suwet'en. My mom was Gitxsan. And I think it's really, really important to right up front approach every community as though they are extremely unique from the next. They have very different languages, they have different cultures, they have different ceremonies, they have different practices, and they have different, most important, capacity. And they are all different. When you look at the cycle of self-governance and self-determination, every community is at a different spot on that cycle of becoming self-governing. And I think that's really important to recognize right up front. And like Kaella had mentioned, you know, talk to them early. You know, I saw a question on the side here just that, you know, how do you get consent from a community? And I would have to say, I've heard some really bad advice from Indigenous relations within oil and gas saying, go in at the last minute, you know, and make it quick so expectations don't grow. That is the worst advice I have ever heard. You need to go in early and go in many times and learn about the communities. And I know you have limited resources on engagement, but this topic is such an important one, and it's important that we learn from the oil and gas industry and we do it better in finding solutions. Masicho.
Thank you very much. Powerful reminder, right? With how we reference ourselves. I kept using Indigenous rather than being specific to each of the nations involved here. Last comment, Gary, to wrap up this part of the summit.
Yeah, no, thank you to all the panelists and to the participants and to yourself, Phil, for your role in moderating. I think three big areas or pillars emerged for me. One is the engagement. So, and the other is the economic involvement. And then third is the regulatory involvement. So on the engagement, and I keep it separate a bit because engagement requires different thinking. And I think Kaella and Jolaine and Matt really touched upon how critical just the practice of engagement and the respect of engagement and being intentional with that community, learning, addressing a lot of the issues, hearing their dreams and their aspirations and their goals and their visions for the future is so critical, important. And that engagement can begin to build trust. It can develop a dialogue of trust where you can actually, and I've been in rooms where we're yelling at each other for a bit, but then it's like you leave the meeting and you can say, okay, I can respect your point. I can understand what you said. I understand your passion, but you left the room as friends or close to friends as possible. But I just can't stress enough, just the engagement and the learning and unlearning. I know I talked about systemic racism and unconscious bias and privilege. That is such a big part to unbundle and to actually drive that engagement deeper. So that's the one pillar. The second opportunity here is the economic engagement and participation. You know, unfortunately, as I said, just the way it is, the Indian Act, the various other legislation just that engineered socioeconomic disparity. Now we're at a unique time where we can catch up and bring Indigenous economies along and have them participate in our Canadian economy, not just as tag-ons, but as drivers, because we're nation builders every day. We're making a difference every day. Understanding that and seeing that and letting us participate in that is critically important. So wealth creation, that drives those socioeconomic benefits. So I think really doing a deeper dive in there and making grants available, facilitating policy, all these different things that could help make that a reality. And then the third thing is our environment is so critically important and dear to us that, and I keep this separate from the first two, but having traditional knowledge, Indigenous knowledge, and having deep regulatory environmental assessment engagement is so critical. And don't lump the three together necessarily. View them as a Venn diagram, more so, that's kind of trying to move in the right direction. To Phil's comment about Kaella, about not being linear and Gantt charts and swim lane charts, it's like, it's big issues that overlap that we want to move forward together. So yeah, make room for that traditional knowledge, Indigenous knowledge in these processes and make sure that, we resource it and support it. So, and not, as I mentioned, deficit theorize that because it's different, it's not as good as Western knowledge.
Well, thank you. We're going to have to close off now. I've been reminded here for the last number of minutes that we're over our allotted time. I first of all want to express my deepest appreciation to all of you for your participation on this panel. You've been terrific. Just a wonderful bit of participation on the part of each one of you. I want to thank you sincerely for giving of your time here today. And hopefully all of what has been said by each of you will lend itself to better understanding on the part of industry, and more particularly a more hopeful message to our people and our communities, because each of you brought a powerful message or messages to the community. And that, in my view, was the most important contribution on the part of each of you. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, and miigwech, everyone, for sharing your insights. And a special thanks to our chair, Phil Fontaine.